Hello and welcome, Dr. Eduardo Mendoza, a research fellow and professor and researcher at Colegio de la Frontera Norte. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Texas-Mexico trade and USMCA. We are really excited to hear about your latest research findings, and I'll let you speak to our audience, and we'll be back at the end with a couple of questions and then to close the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for having me. And well, I'm gonna take the opportunity to talk about some important points about the commercial relationship between Texas and Mexico, which is the most important commercial relation between the United States and Mexico, being Texas the state that trades the most with Mexico. So for that, I'm gonna use a PowerPoint. Just let me see if right here. Here it is. So basically, the title of the PowerPoint is "What is next for Texas and Mexico?" Given two important events: the establishment of the USMCA, which is the agreement between the US, Mexico, and Canada, and also the effects of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic on the Texas-Mexico trade. So those issues are behind the presentation. And so I'm going to show you some important data about the trade between Texas and Mexico and how USMCA is affecting that trade. And this situation, which is we have now, is hopefully a very short and temporary, recession or back down in terms of economic growth and economic trade between Mexico and the United States, which is caused by the pandemic. So let me show you the PowerPoint. And the first graph we have here just shows in general, just to give you a context, what is the trade between Mexico and the United States, what has been the trade between the United States and Mexico since the establishment of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. So as we see here, we have an expansionary trend that was created by NAFTA. I'm not saying that before NAFTA, the trend was towards an increasing trade between the United States and Mexico, but what we saw after NAFTA is an exponential increase in terms of exports and imports, right? So between 1994 and 2009, the US exports to Mexico grew at an annual average rate of 75%, which is pretty high, and it's showing you the increasing importance of Mexico as a trading partner to the USA, because I mean, it's becoming really the first or second after China. Then one important thing we see is that Mexican exports grew at an annual average rate of 8.8, which is surpassing the rate of growth of exports of the US exports to Mexico. So that is showing us that the US has a trade deficit with Mexico, which would be this blue line over here. So it's important to know that the US is importing a lot of goods from Mexico, mainly inputs for firms here in the United States, like the car industry, the electronic industry, and so on and so forth. And Mexico also imports a lot of inputs also to transform them and send them back to the United States, which is called the global chain supply. And in addition, the US, particularly Texas, exports a lot of oil to Mexico and derivatives. So what are the most important goods that are traded or exported from the US to Mexico? Machinery, mechanical appliances, electrical machinery, and here we're talking about mainly electronic components which are sent to Mexico, transformed there, and they come back in forms of TVs, radio, communication equipment, so on and so forth. The US exports a lot of oil, as I mentioned, and gas, gasoline, so on and so forth. components for vehicles like cars, railways, things like that, parts, they are also exported to Mexico, and plastics and derivative and articles of plastic. As I mentioned at the beginning, Texas is the most important state in terms of trade with Mexico. It represents around 35% of all major US states trading with Mexico. And is the second one would be Texas, but as you can see, California, but Texas is really doubles or more than doubles the amount of exports. The second one is a far below second one, California. The third one is Michigan, which is related to the car industry, and then we have Illinois and Arizona. So here are the the amount of exports that we have for 2018, and you can see the amount of exports and imports is in the case of Texas is pretty important. Okay, let me move ahead. What if we go a little bit more on detail, what is exactly what the U.S. exports into Mexico, and particularly the states of the most important states of U.S. in terms of trade with Mexico? In the first place, we have Texas with oil, and also it's pretty important that Texas has a lot of trade with Mexico in terms of computers and electrical machinery. Let's say the electronic and electric sector is very related to Mexico. Texas exports a lot of components that then they are transformed and sent back to Mexico, to Texas. We're talking about computers, we're talking about semiconductors and different electrical parts. So this is a very important sector trading where Texas trades with Mexico. And then we have California with also electrical parts, and then again Texas with plastics and articles and vehicles. So as you see, Texas is the most important state in terms of trade with Mexico. It really doubles California, which is the second. What is Mexico exporting to the US, considering the states of the United States by states? Well, Michigan has to do with cars, mainly auto parts, right? Texas, computer-related machine parts, the second one, then electrical machinery, and then California the same. So what we see here is a very clear intra-industry trade in the electronics and electrical sector, particularly between Texas and Mexico and California too, which is very important to have in mind. So we mentioned that Texas is the most important trading partner of Mexico. If we go even in more detail, we can talk about gasoline, biodiesel, automatic data processing storage units, computers, electronic integrated circuits or semiconductors, combustion, auto parts, propane, so on and so forth. So that's what Texas is important in terms of export to Mexico. And most of these goods are inputs that are processed in Mexico in the maquiladora industry and sent back to the United States in some form, maybe a finished product or semi-finished product. There's also an important trade, Texas imports a lot of stuff from Mexico, which is related to the same sectors: oil, electronic sector in terms of transmission, voice, image, data, vehicles, cars, tractors, TVs, which Mexico is an important TV exporter to the world and to the United States of TVs, and different parts of motor vehicles. So as you see, the trade between Texas and Mexico is concentrated in oil, electronics, and the car industry. What states within Mexico are receiving the export from Texas? What we can see here is that we have Chihuahua is the most important one, Tamaulipas, the state of Mexico, Mexico City, Coahuila, and Nuevo León. So what we see here is that Texas is exporting based upon proximity to the border. And why that proximity? Because that's at the border, particularly in Ciudad Juárez, Nuevo Laredo, Matamoros, Reynosa. That's where the maquiladora industry is located. So they're sending a lot of those products that I mentioned before, like electronics, auto parts, to those regions, particularly Chihuahua, where they are transformed and sent back to United States, to Texas. So we're talking about Chihuahua, Tamaulipas. They are very close to Texas. So distance is a factor because distance has to do with transportation costs. And those two states are basically borders. They have a border with Texas. So those are important. And then we have other states. Coahuila is also very close to Texas. It's also a border with Texas, which is the fifth one. And then we have states that the size of the economic activity is important for the trade with Texas. We're talking about the state of Mexico and Mexico City. This is a very important economic region and also requires a lot of inputs and goods, final goods from the state of Texas. Coahuila and Nuevo León, they are also border with Texas. So as we see, distance and the size of the economy are the very important factors when we're trying to understand what's going on with the trade between Texas and Mexico. What are the main destinations and what are the main goods that are traded? Well, in Chihuahua, we're talking about electrical machinery and parts, which means that in Chihuahua, we have a lot of companies that are requiring inputs in order to transform them and send them back to Texas or the US. Chihuahua is electrical machinery, computers. Tamaulipas the same. And then we have Mexico City, which is not exactly the same intra-industry trade, but basically what Mexico City requires is gasoline and oil, right? Which is what Texas is exporting. The state of Mexico has a little bit of intra-industry trade with Texas. So that's the basic situation. That's what NAFTA created in terms of trade between Texas and Mexico. And now what happened is that by the end of, let's say by 2018, 2016, we started to see some kind of I don't know how to say that, non-invited trading partner, which was China. It's China. China is starting to get involved in the North American free trade. Why? Because the origin of the value added of Mexican exports to the US has more and more Chinese content, which means that Mexican factories are buying inputs from China to use them to re-export to the USA. As you see, the origin of value added in Mexico, 2005, 2015, of let's say a Mexican export to the USA in 2005 had 36.9 content of Mexican value added. The rest was coming from the rest of the world, mainly from the United States. By 2015, that share grew to 1.6, which is okay. Mexico is now developing more and creating more value added. The problem is when we start to see what's going on with China and the US. The US is starting to have less and less value added while China is increasing it. As you see, China used to have 8.7% of the value added of Mexican exports to the United States. Now it has, or by 2015, it had 20.2%, whereas the US reduced its share from 21.1 to 12.8. So that was a problem. And we could see that, we can see that even more pronounced in the case of electronics. And we know that Texas and California are very important in terms of electronics with Mexico and in terms of trade. It's not only cars, but the electronic sector is also very important. And in that sector, what we can see is more and more China is becoming important, right? So China grew from 2005. It had 8.7% of the share of the value added in terms of computer and electronics, 8.7%. And in 2015, grew to 21.10%. So what we can see there is an important increase in terms of, the participation of China in the North American trade, particularly between Mexico and the US. Part of that was a motivation to update, to modernize the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And you know that now, instead of NAFTA, we have a new North American trade, which is modern, but it also changes in terms of the value of the value content of traded goods between Mexico and the US and also Canada. So what the USMCA created or changed? Well, it modernized the rules of origin in terms of intellectual property. Now they are more strict. Now they have a clause in terms of government procurement, try to open, government purchases of goods in terms of the region. I mean, the North American region, the three countries. It has different aspects that had to do with e-commerce, custom facilitation, foreign direct investment, labor standards. That is very important. So all that thing changed, but mostly a very important change was the rules of origin, right? The rules of origin which require domestic content, or at least North American content in terms of exports and imports. Now the level increased for aluminum, steel, and the automobile sectors, right? So the objective is to increase the inputs transformed and produced within one of the member countries of the USMCA. If that requirement is not fulfilled, then that country will have, or that sector in that country, or that firm, that will have higher tariffs, and they will be activated. Okay, and what are those provisions within the USMCA? Well, the regional value content requirement for passengers is increased from 62.5 to 75%, 70% for aluminum, 75% for core parts, engines and things like that, and 70% for principal parts, and for complementary parts, 65%. So whatever car or vehicle that is produced in Mexico, the US, or Canada has to have 75% content of inputs from the region. And that is trying to prevent, non-invited countries trying to get into the North American global change supply, right? USMCA also introduced a new concept, which is the labor value content, which requires a certain percentage of qualifying vehicles to be produced for workers making at least $16 an hour. We're talking about 40% of the motor vehicles. And that is something that is still going on, the way it's going to be handled and supervised. And that is a big challenge for the Mexican economy, because the Mexican economy was one of its comparative advantages was exactly lower wages. So now firms there, they need to see exactly how they're going to work out that requirement. It's still an ongoing issue. If all the exports are, if all these requirements are fulfilled, then the USMCA will continue with a zero tariff, which will be okay. So that's important. And the USMCA will allow free flow of energy between the borders of the North American region, which is also important because it will create conditions to create pipelines, and it will be easier to trade and all those products, which are very important for Mexico, particularly for Texas as we saw before, Texas exports a lot of gasoline to Mexico, right? So that's important. So the oil industry and derivatives make up the largest category of traded goods between Texas and Mexico. It's very integrated, very interdependent. Mexico exports oil, Texas exports gasoline and gas, natural gas, and some other products, refined products. So it's very integrated. We have in Mexico a reform, energy reform, which allow for preserving, creating private ownership of resources extracted, creating contracts for explorations, production and services, opening, refining, transport, storage, so on and so forth. And we need to see what's going to happen with that in this administration of President López Obrador. But that sector is very integrated and is very important. And establishment of the USMCA will continue with zero tariffs for energy products in the North American region. So that is encouraging investments. And if everything goes according to plan with the USMCA, we will have more trade in that sector, the oil and oil derivative sector. As we mentioned before, also, the other important sector is the automobile industry, which is also related to the steel and aluminum industry. And the implementation of the USMCA is going to be, it relies on macroeconomic conditions in Mexico and the US. It also relies on the new requirements, right? Or the potential possibility of imposing tariffs and the continuation of the supply chains in North America, right? So as we saw with the COVID pandemic and the effect on the economy, macroeconomic conditions have restricted, but have negatively impacted trade, but that is just a macro condition. What we see is a lot of integration in terms of the automobile sector. As we see, there's a lot of countries, not only from the United States moving to Mexico, but also we have the Americans, Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, but also we have Toyota, Volkswagen, Fiat, Kia. So in that sense, Mexico is becoming some kind of a economy which is specialized in the production of cars and auto parts. The steel and aluminum industries will also have to comply with value contents of 70 and 75%. And that is very important because a lot of aluminum and steel are used to produce cars. So we need to see how that will be impacting the agreement. So far, it seems like it's not affecting much because after the initial impact of COVID, what we've seen is an increase in trade. So everything is going back to the same trends that we have before. And then we talk about the electronic industry. The electronic industry is really integrated, and it's not only intra-industry trade, which is the same sector trading each other. It's the same sector in Mexico and the same sector in Texas or the USA. But what we see is an intra-firm trade, which is, we're talking about the same firms, big firms, IBM, so I don't know, any big company trading with the same company located in Mexico. So we have a lot of that, and it's becoming a very integrated supply chain, right? 70% of electronic imports from Mexico and 7% of electronics export to Mexico are carried out by parent and affiliate companies. It's intra-firm trade. Finally, this is a brief capsule of what's going on in the Texas-Mexico trade, but I don't want to leave that this presentation without talking about what the effect of COVID. And we know that the effect of COVID was pretty severe, the first 4-5 months of 2020, and is obviously completely related on how the different economies are dealing with the effects of COVID. The recovery in 2020 is depending on the duration of the pandemic and the effective responses of policy responses, right? So briefly, what happened when we had the COVID? Well, that created a sudden stop to contain the pandemic in Mexico, both in Mexico and the US. and that had a negative effect in the oil and manufacturing industries. As you can see, in the first 4 months of 2020, we have annual reductions of oil, electrical machinery, and vehicles of 75, 61, and 83%. So that was a dramatic reduction in imports, and also a dramatic reduction in exports, particularly in the car industry. The car industry was the most affected one, but also obviously in oil and in the electronics and electric parts of machinery. So the lockdown and the policies to contain the COVID that were imposed last year had a very, very negative effect on the trade between Texas and Mexico. However, as you see here, that was last year, this part, sudden drop in trade between Texas and Mexico. But from there on, what we see is a trend of a positive trend in different, on the most important sectors traded between Texas and Mexico. We see an expansion of oil, right? We have an expansion of electric machinery, which is very important, as I mentioned. And we saw increases in vehicles and auto parts. So in general, we could say that today, or let's say up to July of this year, things looks pretty good in terms of trade. Things are getting better. So it seems like the COVID was a temporary problem. It's not, obviously the health issue is not solved yet, but at least it's not affecting trade between Texas and Mexico as bad as at the beginning, as we thought it was going to be at the beginning. And it's the same, imports from Texas to Mexico, they are growing. The same. And then we can, just to make it comply with the time, let's talk about the conclusions of this presentation. The USMCA, that I put it here in Spanish, I'm sorry, to make is the translation to USMCA, is the North American, the US Mexico-Canada Agreement in Spanish. The USMCA rules of origin could have negative effects on the trade depending on input substitution capacity for countries not members of the agreement. Right? So that's very important. Transportation costs measured by distance are still a factor decisive for trade, important for trade. As we saw, Texas really trades a lot with border states of Mexico, particularly the eastern border, northeastern border states of Mexico. The size of the economy is also pretty important, right? And the size of Texas and the size of, the central Mexico area, state of Mexico, Mexico City, Guanajuato, that region, which is very dynamic in terms of economic activity, that's important too. One underlying theme concerns global value chains and their adaptation to the supply chain that is being established in North America. To the possibility of investors both in Texas and in the US and in Mexico, so they could sort of create the conditions to continue with trading and exporting and importing based upon the requirements of the USMCA. The pandemic has generated a partial rupture of global chains between China, Mexico, and the USA, but that is being fixed somewhat, right? As we saw in the graph before, things are picking up again and trade is increasing between Texas and Mexico. So the USMCA will require increased investment in both the US and Mexico to take advantage of the new USMCA rules of origin. If the US and Mexico investors can create the conditions to crowd out the imports from China and produce those inputs that were coming from China within Mexico or in the United States, that would be important because we will be creating more trade and more economic activity both in Texas, United States, and Mexico. Investments in infrastructure are important because, as we saw, transportation costs seem to be very important, as we saw in terms of the trade of Texas and these, border states. So if infrastructure is, if we create infrastructure in the region, particularly in the Mexican side, then that trade could move downwards, right? And move from the border states even downwards to central states of Mexico. And we create more trade and more benefits. So infrastructure is important. So as I mentioned before, the success of the USMCA depends on the macroeconomic conditions of Mexico and the US, and also that on the US and Mexican companies meeting their requirements or face potential tariffs, right? That's what it is. The state of Texas has intensified its trade with Mexico, as I mentioned before, given the short distance between Texas, it's a border state, the economic size, the natural resources, and intra-industry trade. As we saw before, there's a lot of intra-industry trade in the electronics sector. We have natural resources in Texas, and low tariffs have encouraged trade between Mexico and Texas. But as we saw before, trade is concentrated in oil products, electronics, and auto parts. So in that sense, again, just to finish the talk, the USMCA presents challenges and opportunities. Opportunities because now we have the rules where investors can be sure that they can invest, right, in the region to create more trade. The challenges are coming from the necessity of abiding by the new rules in terms of content. So we are in this world where we have global value chains. It's not only North America, but it's Asia and Europe. And in this context, we need to develop this particular North American global value chain, we're going to call it like that, to create these new opportunities for local investors or investors from the three countries, Canada, the US, and Mexico. And with that, I will finish here, and when any questions are welcome. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And yes, we have time just for a couple of questions, and one of them actually is related to now that you mentioned chains. So one of the questions is, you mentioned there are already integrated supply chains within the region, but you also mentioned how trade has been somewhat disrupted because of COVID and the ongoing conflict with China. So what would you suggest or recommend in order to strengthen the existing supply chains within the North American region?
Well, yeah, one important, as I mentioned before, one important factor is for the government of Mexico and the US government to assure confidence for investors in the region. In order to do that, they will need to demonstrate that they will abide, they are willing to support the agreement and abide by the rules of the agreement. So investors have the confidence to move from United States to Mexico, from Mexico to the United States, and particularly focusing on trying to invest in those activities that were sort of being affected by the Chinese trade or the trade with China, particularly electronics. I would say that electronics is an important sector where Mexico can and the United States can cooperate to have a more developed global supply chain. We're seeing it nowadays. Mexico is a producer of semiconductors and chips. Mexico has been producing chips for years, for decades, but it's not an important player. I mean, it's a player, but it's nothing in the international arena, but nothing like the case of China, Taiwan, where the massive production of semiconductors are generated and exported to the world. So that what we're seeing right now, both in the United States and Mexico, and Texas and Mexico, is that the auto industry is sort of paralyzed because they don't have enough semiconductors to produce the cars. So that's one example where the US and Mexico could cooperate to create investments that can expand and modernize the Mexican plants that are producing semiconductors and chips, and to update them to the new requirements, because there are different kinds of semiconductors, right? Very high-tech conductors for very complex electronic equipment, or very simple for cell phones. So I would say that that's an area of importance. The other one has to do with infrastructure. It's important also to develop, particularly in the northern states of Mexico, we need to have a better infrastructure and extended infrastructure to be able to trade, even have more. Time is important in trade, right? Time and distance. So the faster you can cross cargo transportation, railroad transportation, the lower are the cost, and the more incentives you have to trade. So infrastructure, I think, is a very important part of the deal in terms of trying to take advantage of the USMCA to encourage trade between Texas and Mexico.
Well, the next question, I'm going to choose it because it ties in very well to something you just mentioned. You just mentioned how important infrastructure is. And you previously mentioned that distance is also a very important factor between particularly Texas and Mexico trade. So based on what you just mentioned, and in this finding, aside from infrastructure, regarding distance, what else would you recommend in order to further integrate trade between Texas and Mexico? What else is needed?
Well, then there's a bunch of group of policies that you can sort of implement if you want. That has to do with also with time, right? For example, reducing the times, the requirements for, let's say, modernizing customs. So in order to reduce also the time lapses that you need to have in order to cross from Mexico to the US, or from the US to Mexico. We know that we are in the middle of also this illegal trade of drugs and things like that. And so there's a lot of security that needs to be applied to trade. But if you can modernize that with new technology to do it faster, that will create also more opportunities. So custom facilitation, custom reduction of different, paperwork that you need to do, trying to make it easier for trade to move from one side to the other. So that's very important, trade. And there are still some issues that we need to see, particularly in the car industry, that has to do with what is going to happen with the labor content that is required for the production of cars, but that's something that is still discussed. But at that point, investors will need to see what is more convenient. If exporting in Mexico is better, producing and exporting from Mexico is better or not. But that's an issue that is still going on. It seems to me like production continues, but it's something that is still, for me, is a legal thing, though. So I'm not completely sure what's going to happen with that. We'll see in the next coming months. But I would say that, right, has to do with the possibility of, reducing costs. But that cost is very important in terms of decisions of investments and where to trade from. So those are important factors that we need to take a look at that seriously.
Well, that's the time we have for today, Dr. Mendoza. We want to thank you for this presentation. We find your insights really valuable. And we hope we get the opportunity to talk to you soon again.
Sure. Thank you for having me. See you, Jennifer.